Okay, good morning. Hamshach Tzadik Daled. We are on page 141. Yeah, the bottom of 141. So this is a rather relatively lengthy discussion of the Frierdiker Rebbe, elaborating upon which the Ayin Beis, page volume 2, 1157, 1158, explaining how the second level of bittul, or the second type of bittul, which is recognizing that the Oyer recognizes that its entire existence is dependent on its source, and without the source, it has no existence. To find that in Aveda by us in Nivroim, what that is in our being, and that is the contemplation that our existence and our perpetuation, upon contemplation, we come to realize is all due to the divine creative force that creates us and sustains us and gives us that ability to perpetuate and exist and be right. So briefly, he explained that these two types of contemplation, the two psukim, ma rabu masecha havaya, ma godlu masecha havaya, that rabu and godlu refer to quantity and quality, refer to volume, which applies primarily to tzva ha'aretz, which is the creatures, the earthly creatures on earth, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'saaretz aretz, and godlus, which is immense size and quality as well, as he made it clear, refers primarily to tzva hashamayim, the celestial bodies. And hashamayim mistaprim kvoit keil, the heavens, which is tzva hashamayim, relate the honor of God, but he explained misaprim really both tzva ha'aretz, both earthly creatures, as well as the heavenly ones. They both tell a story. The story is, however, a different one. They both tell a story. One, as he said, is more about hakolu elikus, everything is divine, because when you contemplate, you come to realize the details and the species and the subspecies, and every detail governed by God, Hashgacha Pratis. So that tells us, Mol ha'aretz kinyonecha, that the earth is filled with kinyonecha, your possessions. In other words, the earthly creatures and everything on earth, and daimim tzemeya chaim medaber, mineral, vegetable, animal, and human, are all God's possessions. They're all essentially God's handiwork. And as such, it tells us that everything is godliness. The story, the narrative, which is more telling us about, like he said, I'll just use one more expression, the mitzias. It tells us about the mitzias of the Creator. Like he said, like the chochmas shebemaisa, like the wisdom within craftsmanship. The examples we use, whether it's carpentry or embroidery or art. On the other hand, Hashamayim mesaprim kvoid kel, the narrative that Shamayim tells us, heaven, the heavenly bodies, tells us a story more like Chochmas ha-nefesh, more about the inner workings, the muhus. Oh, I'm sorry, no. It says, there's a word I'm just looking for one expression to use. Mahusei shel hamusig. That we get the mahus, we have a deeper understanding of the inner workings of whatever it is that we're, in this case, of course, of godliness. And he calls this that elokus hu hakoil. Not that everything is God, but God is the essence of everything, which we discussed at length in the previous class. What that means, that it's a far deeper understanding. God is your beginning point, as opposed to tzva ha'aretz, you start from the more tangible, like he said. In the meifsim, what verifies and what's the veracity that tells us about godliness in Tzva Haaretz is things that are far more tangible, concrete, and palatable. Or I should say palpable. That's the right word, not palatable. As far as maybe both, as far as Shamayim, it's far more sublime and more ethereal. So that's what indicates it. So even though Chochmas HaNefesh does have practical and tangible application, but it still remains primarily a nafshizdiki, he said, a ruchnizdiki understanding of things, more spiritual. So the heavens tell that story. Then he went on and said, he said, but this will understand the Zohar. The Zohar on the Pasuk Shamayim Mesaprim goes deeper and says, Mesaprim, what, just telling us a story? He says, no, it's not just telling us a story. Mesaprim, from the word, he says that it's misnetzitzin, it illuminates. See, it introduces that it illuminates, and two types of illumination, like a flame, like a fire, and a spark. Basically, a radiating illumination and a sparkling one. And he compared that to the two approaches that we learned earlier of drawing out the flame from a coal, as opposed to the flintstone. By striking it, you get those sparks. Didn't explain, he just said it's Er Yasher and Er Chezer, and both, those are the two different type of illumination that the Zohar talks about. Tzva Haaretz tells a story, he said. That's more the story of the creator, that there's a creator, like he goes back, he said afterwards that it tells us the story, just going back, yeah. The idea that's the story. The story that the creation tells us, meaning the earthly creatures, that there's a creator and there's a divine providence, that everything is godliness. The Shloah Shamayim add an illuminating element to it, which again, he didn't spell out, but based on what he said earlier, it's clear, they illuminate more about the creator. They tell us more about the so-called awesomeness, the bligvul of the creator, the exaltedness, which the Tzva Haaretz tell us, as I said, the volume tells us about the precision, about how the creative force is in every detail, down to the smallest, most minute and weak creature, weak even fiber of existence. Shamayim tells us much more about God's awesomeness. In a way, very similar to what we learned earlier about, are we talking about the creator as he relates to existence, the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, or the ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, which tells us more about God? Is it telling us about the godliness within existence, or telling us more about the personality of God? So clearly, it's more or less that's what he's saying here. That Tzva Haaretz tell us more about the God within existence, and the Tzva Shamayim tell us more about the illuminating, more about the personality of God, of the artist. Not just that there is an artist, but the personality, more of God, the godliness, personality of godliness. Okay. And the last piece we learned was, to explain this, he went to the pasuk Su'u Morim Einechem, and I'm looking now at the bottom of page 141. And you know what? I'm going to read this. Why not read it again? Can't hurt. So he said, so after explaining the difference between Tzva Shamayim and Tzva Haaretz, and he said that the two Naharim, V'netzitzin, are the two forms of Er Yasher and Er Chezer, one that reaches into the Koyach HaMaskil, the power of intellect. But it's a Chamshach and Eloma, it's concealed, but it's already a faculty from which ideas flow. And that's Er Yasher. Er Chezer, by striking it, the sparks reach into the Seichel, Koyach HaSeichel HaYuli HaAtzmi, Natua Umushrish Ba'Nefesh. The core and the potential and core power, a source of Seichel, that's not called a source yet, the way it's rooted and embedded in the Nefesh. That is where the sparks come from. So with that, he flows. We read this already, but I'll read it again now. it says, Sumar menechem rumi bara ela, that meitzim mispet zvam, lukulim b'shem yikara, merev einim v'amitz keach, ish lein neder. It's a full verse. He's going to analyze the whole verse, explaining how this verse encompasses everything we've learned till here, meaning tzva shamayim and tzva aretz. So let's start with Sumar menechem. So the verse literally means, let's just translate it. Raise su'umarim, re'einechem, raise your eyes upward, marim, meaning toward heaven, upward. It doesn't say shamayim, it says marim, okay. Su'umarim einechem, re'umi bara ela, and see or perceive who created ela, mi bara ela, who created all of this. Hameitze b'misper tzvam, the one who draws out. The number of tzvam is like tzva, we'll soon read as tzva shamayim. But basically, all the creatures, l'kulim b'shem yikara, and each one
yikra,
l'kulim b'shem yikra, and each one with their designated name, he calls them. Merev einim v'amitz keach, the power of strength and intensity, with the power of strength and intensity. Ish lo nedar, no single one is missing. Meaning they all are permanent in a way, as we'll soon understand what that means, as he explains. So he says, the Sumarim Enechem Rasha Teva Shma. The three words Sumarim Enechem is the acronym for Shma. Shma Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. So basically, in Sumarim Enechem, you have included in it is the message of Shma. What's the message? Shehu Kamoy Shma Yisrael. It's telling us like Shma Yisrael. You say Sumarim Einechem, raise your eyes upward. It's like Shma Yisrael. Listen, Eden, listen. Aid that hurt. Aid that hurt. So essentially, he's saying like they're lifting your eyes is similar to listening. A Jew that hurt means not just he hears, he senses inwardly, feels it. That what? The Havaya Elokeinu. Remember, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu. What's Havaya Elokeinu? So Havaya is the level of godliness that's beyond nature, transcendent. Elokeinu comes from the word keach v'yechelis, Baal HaKeach v'yechelis, which means Elokeinu refers more to the God's power, creative power. So obviously, there's no parts in God. So you say Havaya Elokeinu. What's Havaya Elokeinu? Sheneshamash Yisrael him l'mayla min hateva. Shema Yisrael, Aid that hurt, that Neshamash Yisrael, l'mayla min hateva, and Hogi Yitamu b'derech l'mayla min hateva. In other words, they're Elokeinu. Even the way they're Elokeinu, the way they are in the world of nature. And the koyach they have is really Havaya Elokeinu. Havaya is their Elokeinu. When we say Havaya Elokim, that the transcendent l'mayla min hateva is their so-called teva, is their being. That's the first half. And then comes the last two words, Hashem Echad. Havaya Elokeinu, so Shema Yisrael, Aid that hurt. This is all into Sumarim Einechem, which means when you lift your eyes upward, you come to this perception, this understanding. That what? That Aid that hurt, that Havaya is Elokeinu, and now Havaya Echad. What's Havaya Echad? Achdus Habeira Baruch Hu b'chol hanivroim. So the first thing is you did hear that Havaya is Elokeinu, and then another understanding that Havaya is Echad, that the Achdus Habeira is not just that God is one, but it's in all the creations. He doesn't say it here, but in other places it says it's hidden in the word Echad. Echad is Aleph, Aluf Shalelam, the Achdus of Hashem. Ches is Shiva Rekiyim Ba'aretz, the seven heavens and earth, and Daled is the Daled Ruch, is the four directions. They're all permeated with the Aleph Echad. So basically, it's saying that this Achdus Hashem is B'chol Nivroim, and he explains, Hainu, the Chol Nivroim Moirim ala Achdus. All the creatures all indicate on divine unity. Even though they're separate creatures and they're different, as we learned, different species, different individual, each leaf even is different, but they all indicate an Achdus. He says, now, this is all, so what's the connection to Su'umarim Einechem? This is Shema Yisrael. says, Hine hasoga mizeh hu besu morim enechem. This hasoga is in the words besu morim enechem. The kasher. So what does that mean? Shema Yisrael is the statement that Ayin Beis, a Jew senses or feels, or that he more than intuits. He senses that avayza lekeinu and avayza chod. But now, how do you get to that point? How do you get to Shema? You get to Shema by sumar menechem. When you lift your eyes upward, what does that mean? You're taking yourself out of gashmis chumrius. In other words, that you are not allowing. Here it says kasher meitzi atzmim min agashmis hachumrius, which means when you lift yourself up and you remove yourself, you extract yourself. That's the word. Extract yourself from the crassness of gashmis. Because when you're in the crassness of gashmis, you're not looking upward. You're looking at yourself. You're driven by your needs. As a matter of fact, I'll explain in a minute. Let me just finish. Oz, when you draw yourself out, you extract yourself from gashmis and chumris by looking upward. Oz hinu bali de riyas ha'emes. Then you come to see the truth, not the truth of your own self-absorbed, crass, gash materialism. Riyah, ru'u mi bara'ela. Remember, ru'u, sumar menechem, ru'u, riyah sa'emes, mi de mi bara'ela. You come to recognize and see the truth that what? Who created all of this? And he says this, shehem tzva ha'aretz. Mi bara'ela is referring to the tzva ha'aretz. So when you lift yourself up and you extract yourself from gashmis, chumnius of gashmis hachumnius, you come to recognize. So he's telling us how you get to Shema. He doesn't say this, but one of the reasons we cover our eyes by Shema, because we want to cover our looking at gashmis. We want to focus on Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. When you look at the world around you, you get trapped by it. It seduces us. So in a way, so he's telling us, how do you get to that state of Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu? You do it through the hasog of sumar menechem, by lifting your eyes, meaning lifting your eyes upward. Let me just explain it a little more. Frierdiker Rebbe in the Sichos brings an expression as a behemoth kemel de shemayim nish gesehen, kemel himmel nish gesehen. An animal has never seen heaven. Why? Because animals walk on all four. As they walk on all four, so therefore, when they walk on all four, they don't see heaven. They see the ground, because that's how they were created. Their physiological structure is aligned with their psychology and spiritual structure. An animal is not meant to look upward. An animal is meant to survive, to take care of its young, to breed, to protect, and so on, to feed. So if you look at the psychology of an animal, you'll see, whether it's a cow or any animal, you don't see that any of them are aspiring to build better homes, to build fax machines and smartphones and internets and fly to the moon. Why? Because an animal doesn't have such an aspiration. It's focused on its existence. The animal within us, the nefesh habamis, is about its own survival. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I want power, I want control. Now, I'm not even talking dvarim asurim. We're not talking about anything prohibited. It's about itself. What is a human being was created walking upright? We walk upright. So our eyes can look up to heaven. We have a choice. You can look down to earth and be focused on earthly things, like he says, gashmis chumris. But you could also lift your eyes to heaven. And when you lift your eyes to heaven, you're seeing and you experience something beyond yourself. Even by gashmis, I explain this very often in classes, that the human being, we have always aspiring to better homes and better lives. And we fly to the moon and to the heavens. We look up and we see the stars and we want to know what's out there. Curiosity, we spend trillions of dollars to satisfy, is there life out there? What's out there? Animals don't have that need. So many ways, when you think Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the soul of a human being is the flame. A flame is always looking upward. It's licking the sky. The wick grounds it. So we are a combination. Like the Gemara says, 3 things in which we're compared to an animal and 3 things which we're compared to angels. We have a nefesh alikis that looks upward, a nefesh abamis that looks downward, and we have a choice. So just to elaborate, so Sumar Menechem is telling us, choose, lift your eyes to heaven. Don't look down. Don't look into your gashmis and chumrius and to your own needs and so on. Look upward. And when you look upward, you come to recognize the emes, ru'umi bara'ela, who put all this in place. This, he says, is the contemplation connected to tzva ha'aretz. Who put all this in place that you see? Even though it's true we're looking up to heaven, Shamayim, but he's going to talk about Shamayim in the second half of the pasuk. So the first half, Su Morem Erechem Ru'umi bara'ela, he says, is tzva ha'aretz, and that's the essential contemplation that leads to Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, which has 2 statements there. Shema Yisrael, a Jew should head, which is like lifting your eyes up, and what? Havaya Elokeinu, that the words he used is that Kechenu Havaya, Elokeinu the Kechenu Havaya, that our koyach is l'mayla min hateva and neshamas Yisrael, and that the anhaga with them transcends nature. And the second half, the Achdus Hashem in every creation. This is the first half of the pasuk. Now he's going to go the second half. Okay. Does anybody have any question on this before I go to the second half of the pasuk, the Tzva Shamayim, which he's going to talk about now? Okay. Now he says, continues, 3 lines from the bottom on page 141. And the one that draws out mispar tzvam, the number of tzvam of the army, the military, the army, hu hayidiyah v'hasaga b'tzva shamayim. This is the perception and hasaga and the comprehension of b'tzva shamayim, in tzva shamayim. So the first half was tzva ha'aretz. So we know their modem is about, you're looking up to see the creator who created everything on earth. The Achdus Hashem in the Nivroim. Now we're talking about an awareness and a comprehension in the Tzva Shamayim. So what do we see? What do we know from Hashemayim Mesaprim of Tzva Shamayim? V'hainu, this means the Klolos Abriya, Afil Tzva Oretz, Shehem Kayomim Rak B'min V'lei B'ish. The general, he's going to explain now. The general creation, even Tzva Oretz, even the earthly creatures, which are Kayomim, they only perpetuate B'min, in their species. Remember, we learned earlier, only their species. V'lei B'ish, not as individuals. There's no individual creature on earth that lasts forever, meaning throughout the creation. A parent gives birth to a child. This is true in the animal kingdom as well, the vegetable kingdom as well. You have trees, plants, they don't last forever, but they continue in their species. Daimim, I don't want to talk about daimim right now because we discussed, I mentioned daimim seems to be a stone, doesn't disappear, doesn't have children. So what, is it also kayomim b'min or b'ish? I never heard anyone talk about that, but it's an interesting question. Unless you say that stones, after a while, erode, they don't really last, not like the sun. You could say that maybe. That mineral also at some point deteriorates, maybe. Just lasts longer, that's all. But they don't, but do stones give birth to other stones? Not birth, could be, I don't know, I have to think about that. But it's not relevant to the theme here. She says, Kolos Abriya, even Tzva Oretz, which their perpetuation is only in species, not in individual. Hem gamke machlichim. They also compel us to say, Hashem molvad hachayis. Next page, 142. They also compel us to say that besides the chayis aliki hamalubish b'chol nivra la'achyese, that besides the fact that there's a chayis aliki, a divine vitality that manifests and is enclosed in every creature la'achese to sustain it or to energize, to give it life. Besides that, we're also compelled to say, Hinei yeshne eir v'chayes aliki bli gvuli. Now he's introducing bli gvuli. you have to say, because it perpetuates, you have to say, not only is there a chayes aliki that gives it life, we're talking about tzva oretz even, but there's also an infinite power in this divine energy. Shu hamanig u'mechayes kol hanevroim, which governs, rules, and energizes and gives life and sustains all the nevroim, even the tzva oretz. Why? How do you know this? Ki achayes aliki hamalubish b'chol nivra hu mugbal. If you're talking about the first thing, the chayes aliki, let's say in a stone, or in a plant, or in an animal, or in a human being, it's mugbal. The chayes aliki is limited and tailored. Not the eliki part. We're not talking, obviously, God's godliness itself is not limited. But the energy is very much channeled and tailored to the creature. If it was blig vul, the creature couldn't be a unique, specific, limited, like we learned earlier. It's gedder, it's parameters. So the chayes aliki in every creature is limited according to that creature. Just like the chayes aliki in chachma is limited to chachma. It's not bina. We're not talking about be'etzem. We're talking about as it manifests in the creature. Shari beguf mugbal, because in a guf mugbal, in a body that is limited, a defined and finite creature, a finite guf. It's not possible. We're not talking about tzad kol yachol. It's not possible from our understanding that it should have a chayes built in mugbal. So in other words, the chayes aliki diminishes itself, conceals itself to become mugbal within the guf of whatever it is that we have. Like it says, we learned that the Eibishter stretches out his finger, and even a malach burns up. Because if it was blig vul, it would just explode. It would be like electricity going into an appliance without any filters, without any levers and gauges and regulators. What would happen? The whole thing would explode. You can't have blig vul energy in a gvul container. So there can be bilti mugbal in a guf mugbal. That's what he says here. V'im kain, if that's the case, hari tzarich liyas hefsek v'shinui. So if that's the case, then the creatures on earth, we'll get to heaven shortly, the next chapter. He's coming to explain Hamoitzi Tzva Shamayim, but he went back to explain that even the Tzva Oretz also indicate on something blig vul, because if not, if based on this, if blig vul can't go onto a gvul, so there should be a hefsek v'shinui, that the creatures on earth should at some point pause. Hefsek, they should stop. They should, what's the word that we use on hefsek? Be interrupted, v'shinui, and should be subject to change. Umizeh, the fact, shem kayamim b'min, the fact that they perpetuate in species. True, it's species, but if it's a koyach mugbal, then the human race should die out at some point. They don't have blig vul. Why does it continue to perpetuate? Harizeh hira, that's an indicator. That indicates that establishes or demonstrates the levad achayis aprati. He's going back to the opening line, that besides for the specific vitality and energy shababi slapshus b'chol nivra that comes enclosed and manifest in each individual creature, hariyesh by er v'chayis bli gvuli. You have to say that there is also some element of a er v'chayis, an energy and life force, or energy and strength and power that is unlimited, bli gvuli, without a gvul. Why? Because you see the species continue. What's giving it that type of perpetuation? It means that there's somewhere a koyach gvuli. Now, it's not a contradiction to what he just said, because it's not that the er ha-bli gvul, the koyach bli gvuli, is in each creature. That's why we die. That's why the creatures do die. But it means in the min ha-kloli, let's say min ha-adam, or min ha-chai, or min ha-tzameach, there's also an er chayes that's making sure the species will not die out. I know you could ask the question, what about those species that have gone extinct? That's because God wanted them to go extinct, not because they lost their power or human beings intervened And we can technically go and kill all the fox on earth, all the whales. That's a human being's choice to destroy God's creation. But we're talking about it on its own. So the fact that something goes extinct is not because suddenly lost its chayes bli gvul. It means the Eibishter wanted it to end, and that's it. Something come to an end. But the fact that it continues on. So, for example, if you built something, a human being built something, and there's no koyach bli gvul, at some point it's gonna end. There's nothing that lasts forever. That's man-made. But the Eibishter can put a koyach bli gvul in the min of the species that allows it to go on. So there's two elements going on so therefore the hisbaranus and tzva ha'aretz leads you to two things, that there's a chayes aliki in everything, and there's also an element of a koyach habli gvul, chayes bli gvuli, and that's what perpetuates it and does not die out.
If a human being is building, that's not a new thing.
What?
I said, you said if a person is building something, it's not existing forever. A person is building something, he's not creating a new thing. If you're building a house, it could stay for 500 years. But it's not his credit, not a human credit.
Yeah, it's yesh miyesh, right. Shekol zeh anu yedim gam mitzvah aretz. All this we just discussed, this little section, we also know this from tzva aretz. So basically he added now that tzva aretz also tell us more about God, but it's still, remember, it's still limited in all the ways we discussed earlier. It's still the perspective that from the earthly creatures, we come to establish there's a creator, there's Ashgacha Pratis, he said. There is the Chayes Aliki in each detail, which includes Ashgacha Pratis. And now there's also a Koyach Bli Gvuli that sustains the species. This is all from Su'umar Menechem and from the Mesaprim, the story, the narrative that Tzva Ha'aretz tells. But Tzva Shamayim comes and introduces another dimension, which is far more illuminating and far more telling us more about God than the creatures on earth. And that's what he's going to say now. However, this idea, this bli gvul, is understood and understood and comprehended better or more, greater from the heavenly celestial bodies. That's what he's going to now explain in the next chapter. Now, I just want to stop for a moment before we continue. Just to explain something. You may recall in volume 1, when he spoke about this idea he actually talked about Misaprim, Sipur. Remember, Sphira, the Sphiris, the Esther Sphiris of Atzilus have three meanings. He actually ended up 4 meanings, but 3 general meanings. From the word mispar, like moitzi mispar, to count, actually a number. So a number tells you something. What does it tell you? Volume. It tells you how many, so it tells you something about the item. A deeper meaning is sipur, an actual story. And there, if you remember, he said in volume 1 that it tells us the story of the Eibishter, and you're beginning to perceive some of the bli gvul. Mispar is gvul. Mispar by definition, it's a number. Maybe a large number, but it's a number. Whole discussion about numbers, if you remember from the Siddur. Then he went and said, deeper is the story, and it's a story that starts telling us about the Beira a bit. Not completely, but it starts telling us about the Creator, and I believe he brought this idea of the bli gvul in the Tzva Shamayim, Tzva Aretz and Tzva Shamayim. I don't know about Tzva Shamayim. I have to look it up again. So that now you're beginning to get to know that the artist didn't just create art, but the artist has some bli gvul to him. And the proof is in the perpetuation of the species, kayom and b'min of the Tzva Aretz. Then came the interpretation number 3, from the word Even Sapir, Sphira from the word illumination or transparent. Like he's saying here, illumination, Mesaprim from the word Narin or Netzitzin. What's the word? Illumination is more than just telling a story. Now you're seeing it. That's what illumination is. It's transparent. It's like a oir that now is revealing a much higher dimensions of Elokus. So I have to look up back there, but it sounds like that if you go using those 3 steps, it sounds like Tzva Ha'aretz are a combination of Mispur and Sipur on the lower level, and Tzva Shamayim is Sipur and Sapir on a higher level. Just wanted to connect it. Now, I don't know if he's going to say it. I don't think he's going to say it explicitly, but if you remember that, it makes it very all-rounded, because there it was also discussing the interface. Because at the end of the day, these are different levels of perception and godliness. A lower level, a higher level. It's still all, and I'm not going to go as far as to say, is this Das Tachten, Das Elyon? Clearly, to me, this is Das Tachten. Even Tzva Shamayim is Das Tachten, most likely, because it's our contemplation. But it's beginning to give us a lot more about godliness. And that's what the next chapter is dedicated to. Okay, so let's talk about Tzva Shamayim, which is Kayomim Be'ish. Remember, now is going to come a new thing. It's not Kayomim B'min. In Tzva Aretz, the perpetuation, the Blik Vul is on the overall species. So you could almost say it's like more makif, more hovering. In Tzva Shamayim, each individual creature in the heavenly bodies lasts forever. So of course, that's going to teach us more about the Blik Vul, which is what we're going to learn now in the next chapter here. But before we go, if anybody has any question, I think it's pretty clear. And remember, all this is coming to give us a taste in the second type of bittul, that we come to recognize a koyach eliki, that our true existence and our reality comes from something greater than ourselves. It's not us. So clearly, now we know, as I said from Tzva Aretz, that there's governance, creation, the hashgacha pratis, and now even Blik Vul. That means our existence and our kiyum is not up to us. Obviously, it's not oir in the true form of oir, but it's already giving us a taste of bittul to something greater than ourselves. And now Tzva Shamayim is going to introduce another level in that. So Bira Inyan. This is called chapter 30 in Sadik Daled. And just for the record, on page 144, 2 more pages, or actually, 2.5 pages, we're going to conclude this second level and type of bittul with all this elaboration that the Frierdiker Rebbe explained. If you want to see how fascinating it is, you go back to Ayin Beis. Ayin Beis, all this is one parenthesis on page 1158. Yeah, that one parenthesis. Sorry, on the bottom of page 1157. Ubitl zeh b'nivroim. Yeah, these 7 pages is all based on the beginning of the parentheses. Ubitl zeh b'nivroim yesh leimer. Just to show you how the Rebbe develops an idea from his father, Rebbe Rashab. Okay, Ubira Inyan, who the explanation of this is. We're talking now about Tzva Shamayim, that you havana moving v'musig yesem at Tzva Shamayim. So now we're going to explain what that means. Explanation is the Hiniksiv. Another pasuk he's introducing. Ela tells us Hashemayim va'aretz behi baram. In Bereshis, at the end of creation, we have a pasuk. Ela tells us this is the narrative, or this is the story of Hashemayim va'aretz, heaven and earth, bihibaram, in their creation. Of course, the word bihibaram needs explanation. So we're going to discuss what Chazal says with the word bihibaram. What would be wrong if he just said, tell the Hashemayim va'aretz, bihibaram, in their method, in their way of creation. So what is he saying? Saying Shemayim va'aretz, of course, goes back to Bereshis bara Elokim Shemayim va'aretz, that Shemayim v'chol ha'galgalim v'tzva maila, or now he spells out. Hashemayim means heaven. V'chol ha'galgalim, and all the spheres, v'tzva maila, and all the celestial bodies. So according to Torah, just to give you a short, if you read the Rambam, the beginning of the Rambam, he speaks, the way Torah describes, Torah-based Torah astronomy sees that there are 9 galgalim. A galgal means literally a wheel, a sphere. They're like 9 hemispheres. And in each hemisphere, like you think of it like rings. One ring above, inside of another, like concentric circles. In each hemisphere resides different celestial bodies. For example, the moon is, I think, in Galgal Hasheni. I don't remember exactly. The sun is in a higher Galgal. So the planets, each one have their different Galgalim. So think of it like
Galgal is like a ball, right? A ball.
But no, but it's like not. Think of it like 9 spheres, one inside the other, like 9 concentric circles. The Galgal Hayemi is the 9th, but let's not talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, but the Galgal is surrounding you from all over, the Milo, the Mato, from all over, right?
Let me explain it so people could understand. So if we are here on Earth, as I said, atmospheres surrounding would be the Galgal Harishan would be the closest circle, sphere surrounding. The Galgal Hasheni would be one further out. Galgal Hashlishi further out. And in the Galgalim is the Tzva Maila, are the different celestial bodies, the moon, the earth, the moon, the sun, the stars, the planets, and whatever else is out there. So that's how Torah sees it. So I just wanted to explain what Galgalim mean. Now, the Rebbe actually wrote a letter to the Ragat Shover, which is printed, one of the first letters the Rebbe ever wrote to the Ragat Shover in the early 20s, or maybe mid-20s. He writes, he's asking Kvoid Hara, with all the titles to the Ragat Shover, can you please organize and make a seder of all the whole astronomy according to Torah and reconcile it with modern science? We don't have any record of the Ragat Shover answering the Rebbe, but it's been a challenge because the way Torah depicts the astronomical picture is somewhat different than what modern science does. It doesn't mean there's contradictions necessarily, but it's a different way of looking at it. Of course, it also addresses the issue of geocentric, which means does the earth go around the sun or the sun go around the earth? And according to the Galgalim, everything surrounds the earth. So I don't want to go into this. It's not relevant to our discussion. I just wanted to explain what the word Galgalim means. So all this, the Rambam explains in the beginning, Hilchos Yesod HaTorah, when he talks about he talks about all the Galgalim and what planets or what bodies, celestial bodies, exist in each Galgal. Okay. It's complicated stuff, but let's go on. So he says, so now we say, Shemayim va'aretz, Elatildas ha-Shemayim va'aretz bi-bottom. He says, the Shemayim v'chol Galgalim v'tzmamel harihem kiyem hi-bottom mamish. So bi-bottom comes to tell us that all the heavenly bodies are exactly the way the day they were actually created, without any change, without any shift. That's bi-bottom. That's mamish kiyem hi-bottom mamish. And he's going to bring from Yerushalmi to explain what the exact language. So Elatel Shemayim v'aretz bi-bottom, that everything is Shemayim. He's not saying now Oretz, but Oretz is Kayom and Be'ish, B'min. So it's also Bi-bottom, but in species. But he's talking now Be'ish. So it's Kayem Bi-bottom Amish, exactly as it was when they were created. K'di'isha B'Yerushalmi, like it stated, like it says in Yerushalmi, the Rebbe says down below the footnote, Reish Brachas, right in the beginning of Masechta Brachas. Oh, actually, I didn't sing the right niggin. What I just read is from Yerushalmi. That's what it says in Yerushalmi. That Bihibara means not just these are the story of Shemayim v'aretz Bihibara when they were created, that they are Kihibaram, Kiyem Hibaram Mamash. V'hainu, and the Friedrich Rebbe now explains. Gam d'tzva Shemayim him gam kin nivroim mugbolim. Even though the celestial heavenly bodies are also nivroim mugbalim, they're also mugbal. They're very large, but they're not blikvul. Whether the sun, the moon, the stars, the galgalim, they all have parameters. As I said, they could be enormous, but they're still gvulim. Nivroim mugbalim. Umerkavim, and more than that, umerkavim meguv nefesh mugbal, and they're a composite. Murkav means that they are a mixture, a composite of a guf and nefesh mugbal. Remember, according to the Rambam, the Tzva Shamayim Bali Deyahem, they actually have some form of perception. So that we call them a nefesh. It's not a nefesh ha'adam. They don't have the intelligence necessarily. Well, they have intelligence.
Smarter. The Rambam said they are smarter than Adam.
Yeah, smarter than Adam and less than a malach. Right, correct. So they have a guf nefesh, mugbal. And both of those, it's mugbal. They're murkiv, meguf nefesh, mugbal. So the number one is they themselves are just limited in size and in parameters and definition. And they're murkiv, a compositive of a guf and nefesh, a body and a spirit that are limited. I meant to say they don't have bal b'chira. They don't have the free will of humans. That's what I meant to say. But yeah, but balidei, okay. V'heim, efshari ahefsid, k'moy tzva aretz mamish. And on their own, because they're limited, they're completely subject to erosion and deterioration. That's what hefsid means, weakening. Mamish like tzva. In other words, on their own, because they're mugbal, remember we said something that's mugbal doesn't have any bleak vul to it. So on their own, they're afshari, they're fully capable of erosion. Like you see, scientists say that the sun is burning out. It may take many years. But why? Because everything in this physical world erodes. It may take thousands of years, fine. But fuel ultimately is going to be depleted. Uka klal hayedua, like the axiom, the known rule and principle. The Rebbe Tzeichens, if you look in the bottom, Meir Nevuchim, Ikrim, and the Rishim of the Tzemach Tzedek before. But he says, "V'tzorich k'tzas ha'shayches kan." And the Rebbe says, "Tzorich k'tzas," which means you need some explanation. Why is this relevant to us here? But let's see what he says first before we explore that. U'kaklala yedua, to kol ha'efsheri b'min, I efsher shelo yovei. Just 1 second. So the klal goes like this. The efsheri, anything that is possible. The min here means in that particular species or entity. It ultimately will happen. It means it's not possible that it won't ultimately happen. In other words, if you say something is defined, is limited, so even though right now it seems to have enormous power, but because it's subject to deterioration, or I said depletion of its resources, it's impossible that it will not ultimately happen. It will ultimately run out. He's going to bring a little later the klal from the Bechaye that says, "Tinuk mishaneled maskilis yavish." You don't say, for example, a human being. I'll just explain this on a human level. We don't say that you are infinite and eternal until you get older and then you start weakening, and then till a person dies after Me'ev Esrim Shana. That's not what you say. Because we're created in a way that's limited. From the moment you're created, you're already subject to this slow aging process. It just becomes apparent at the end. So what he's saying, basically, everything that is subject to, efshari means it's possible that it's, for example, elikus is not efshari to have this. Kol haven nifsid, you don't say by elikus, you don't say it's not capable, it's not subject to deterioration, God forbid. A creature is. So ultimately it's going to happen. It's just a matter of b'koyach and b'poil. So he's basically saying something that is in a potential state will ultimately become actualized. Just another way of saying it. Kol efsheri b'min, everything that's possible in this domain, it's not possible that it won't happen. It will ultimately happen. So you don't have to wait till 120 years to know that Bizman Hazeh, before Mashiach comes and Tchias HaMesim, you don't need to be, it's not a munah to say that every human being is going to pass away. It's just a question of when. Because the min is subject to hefsedis. That's what he's saying. What the Rebbe is saying, tzarichin ktsas, he's probably saying is, how is this relevant here? I'm not sure what the Rebbe means because it seems to be relevant for a very simple reason. If it were not for the koyach habeira habli gvul, everything in existence as gvul is capable of erosion and depletion. So ultimately it will happen. And it's only because there's a koyach habli gvul, the Eibishter infuses, that changes it. So why is this rule not applicable here? I'm not sure why the Rebbe says tzarichin ktsas. Still ktsas. But in other words, if you took this line out, I think it fits to the word, because remember the line before he says, Efshari ahefsid, that Tzva Shamayim are subject to and completely subject to hefsid on their own. So I think the next line, since Efshari ahefsid, then efshar shalayave. So then ultimately it will happen. It could be that Rebbe is bothered by the fact that it doesn't happen. Because once the Eibishter puts the koyach habli gvul, the sun and the moon will not die out. So maybe that's why. But the Frierdiker Rebbe is speaking hypothetically if you don't have the koyach habli gvul, meaning creation on its own. So therefore, when you see there's a koyach habli gvul, it tells you that creation is getting a power that's outside of our own power. That's giving it eternal perpetuation. So I'm not positive about the tzarichin ktsas. I need to look into it more. If you have any thoughts, by all means. But let's continue inside. So it says the kainhu, the bitzvah, and the kainhu, and this is how it is. The bitzvah oretz ma'achar. That in the earthly creatures, ma'achar, due to the fact that kavona el yena behem, that the kavona yena, God's intention in them, asher yufsedu, the seder of Eifanav seder is the Gashmi, God's intention that they should erode and they should diminish and should be depleted. The seder of Eifanav seder is the Gashmi, and the order and the rules that govern the normal process of erosion or what did I say before? Deterioration. Of a Gashmi is the good thing. Hina levad zeis dehem nefsadim beish. So he's saying, besides the fact that nefsadim beish, that the individual creature on earth, nefsadim, weakens and deteriorates up to the point of perishing. Hine gam bezeh she'enim nefsadim. In other words, and even the things that are not diminished, pirush, bezeh she'em kayomim b'min, the fact that their species perpetuates, hine mikol mokim harehem nechloshim. Nevertheless, because they're subject to erosion and depletion, nevertheless they get weaker. It doesn't matter, even if their species is perpetuated, every individual creature on earth gets weaker and ages. And why is this the case? Because that's because on their own they're subject to erosion and depletion. So what he's saying here is that even though they may have something that keeps the species going, but each one of them, because they're subject to erosion, they will ultimately erode, and they do. Mashenkin b'tzva shamayim. By contrast, the heavenly bodies, shakavona al yenebem sheyu kayomim beish. There, the divine intention, the kavanah above, is that they should be perpetuate as individual creatures. Hine avgam ime yesem bali guf murkav. V'efsharia hefsid. So though they are bali guf, they are bodies that are murkav, that are composites, which means that they're limited. V'efsharia hefsid, and they are subject to diminishment. Nevertheless, not only do they perpetuate individually, the ish loy nedar behem, back to the pasuk. Not one of them is missing, meaning not one of them gets diminished. Ela avgam zeis, the efen kiyumam, but additionally, the way they perpetuate, hu mashehem chazokim kiyem hibaram, they are as strong as the day they were created, belishum shinei v'hefsek klal, without any change or interruption at all. Interruption is the word. Okay. This needs to be a little unraveled, even though the content is clear. But he began by saying that the Cherush Tzva Shamayim on their own are not subject, are limited, and therefore should be subject to change and to interruption. The only reason they're not, he doesn't say it explicitly, is because God wanted them not to be. So it's a godly power outside of them, so to speak. But then, maybe this is what's bothering the Rebbe, because the flow here, he suddenly moved and jumped a step and said that that's true with Tzva Ha'aretz, that even though they perpetuate species, but the individual remains weak and diminishes and ultimately perishes. With Tzva Shamayim, he suddenly said there the kavanah is that they should perpetuate. Not only do they, therefore, they perpetuate. They should perpetuate. So he says two things. Not only is it fact that even though they are limited creatures, they each remain intact, which means they don't disappear. He says more than that. Not only don't they disappear, which means they don't die, they're as strong as they were the day one. Because they could also, you could say, you know what, the sun will not perish. That's what Hashem wants. But who says it's not diminishing? The Chazakim Kiyemi Baram, which is the Yerushalmi, Kiyemi Baram Mamish, that tells you they're not that, more than that, they're just as strong as the day they were created, without any diminishment at all. So clearly this is coming from a power outside Tzva Shamayim. But I think like in the way the text is written, it sounds like first he's distinguishing, but still at the end of the day, it's not Tzva Shamayim's power. It's coming from outside. The only thing is, the difference is the kavanah el yena, the intention with the earthly creatures is they should be, only the species should be preserved and perpetuate. But the creature itself is both things. Number one, doesn't last. And number two, because efshari, it's possible to diminish. It does diminish every second. It's diminishing. Tzva Shamayim, the kavanah is that they should remain. So not only do they remain, that they don't perish, they're as strong as the moment that they were created. So both ways, they're different than Tzva Ha'aretz, but it's still going to go back that all this can only be because there's a higher power. It's not coming from itself. So what he's saying now, he's just explaining the difference between the two. And you see both of them as the kavanah el yena. It's God's power and intention that governs this fact. But we'll learn further. We'll stop here. We'll learn further and we'll develop it.
L'chorah, it's the same. It's a different kavanah, but both are totally in the koyach halaki.
Well, that's what he's going to discuss in a chanami. But you see, the koyach halaki manifests differently. One that still remains. In other words, Shoah Shamayim, you see more of bligvul, basically. Even though, yes, it's not. Of course, it's misaprim kveit kel. But just be patient. He's going to explain it more. This is what the whole chapter is about. So yes, both of them are going to tell us about God's power. The difference is how that manifests. Like Tzva Shamayim, you can say God's bligvul actually impacts the Tzva Shamayim much more than it does in Tzva Ha'aretz, because the thing itself becomes, the pella of Tzva Shamayim is obviously more than Tzva Ha'aretz, because even though it's a murkev and a mugbal, it's still not just to perpetuate, not just that it doesn't die, it also perpetuates with the same strength. So obviously that's even a bigger chiddush. You know, it would be like human beings living forever without ever weakening one drop. That would be quite a feat. Yes, coming from Kayach HaBeira, but it does manifest in a more, it's like a miracle almost, more of a miracle than Tzva Aretz. But you know, we're going to learn more. We don't have to jump. So I'll stop here, middle of page 1.